Okay, so our second panel is what are the solutions to breaking through the barriers of systemic racism? And today I have Andrea Okoro, who's an associate at McDermott, Will and Emery, and they're also a sponsor of the event. Also have Animah Kosai, who is the founder of Speak Up at Work. Also have Madeline McNeely, who is the founder of Conditioning Leaders. And then last but not least, I have Minita Shah-Mara, who is the Vice President of Organization Effectiveness and Global Diversity and Inclusion at Biogen. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so Minita, I want to ask you the first question. At Biogen, you have a four-pronged approach around diversity and inclusion. Can you talk more about the first two strategies related to advancement and development, as well as people and business leaders?
Sure, Pam. Hi, everyone. It's really an honor to be on this panel. I'm looking forward to learning from colleagues on the panel today, too. So for those that may not be familiar with Biogen, we're a large biotech company of about 8,000 individuals globally, and we're focused in the disease areas related to neuroscience. And so in terms of, our four-part strategy, I'd say, we've been on a formal journey around advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion around probably 6 to 7 years at this point. And what I would say is, like many companies, in June, after George Floyd's death and many other Black individuals losing their lives, and corporate America really stepping up, and many CEOs saying that something needs to be done, we looked at our strategy, and so looked at it from the lens of not just the strategy, but the experiences of individuals, as well as the data within the organization around our talent-related data, promotion, advancement, hiring, etc. And did a lot of listening, candidly, and listened to our employees about experiences, about opportunities, and from that created a four-part advanced racial equity and inclusion strategy that we launched on Juneteenth this year. And so the first two parts really was around building awareness, capability, and an urgency to act. So how do we, in this bucket, create much more empathy, but have that empathy coupled with a sense of how to urgency to act and what to do. And so part of that is around building clear metrics and transparency around metrics and data, and then also capability around how to find the right talent, how to be having conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion in a way that are productive from a leadership perspective. The role of people leaders in really advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in each one of their talent-related decisions, if you will. So that's sort of the first quadrant. The second is around building intentional talent, and that's sort of a focus on the pipeline of underrepresented talent into the industry. So really continuing to invest further in pipeline programs for youth in advancement around STEM, exposure to STEM. We have a community lab where we've had thousands of youth in the local community go through a summer of really sort of understanding what it means to be a bench scientist, what it means to have another type of role within biotech, if you will. And so really broadening exposure, so deepening our commitment in that space, but then also from a development perspective within our own organization and investing further in leadership development programs and putting out there that we would be, we've found a lot of success with an organization called the Partnership Inc. And what we've done is made a commitment to make much more of an investment when we know the data has been amazing around those individuals that have gone through the leadership development programs from the partnership, and that's for underrepresented talent. We've seen quite a lot of transformational experiences, and so it's partly making sure that we're doubling down in the areas that we've seen strong success, but then also looking at different areas to invest in. So we made a real commitment to significantly increase our partnership with historically Black colleges and universities in terms of our internship pipeline and our so that's sort of another way of really growing the pipeline. So I'd say that those are the two buckets. And in the building intentional talent piece, we've also around that gotten clear that we are looking to make a 30% increase of representation of Black and Latinx individuals within our leadership ranks. And so, you know, putting it out there and saying that we're not, you know, before it was really about an aspirational goal of having a mix of individuals in the company that represent the populations that we serve, the broader population in the country. And we've gotten a lot more clear about where we are and where we want to go, and understanding there are multiple levers to be able to get there, from, you know, hiring, advancement, promotion, development, et cetera. So those are the first two buckets. I'm sorry if that was a little long-winded, but that's sort of what I'd say was our sort of foundational work.
Thank you, Minita. There's a lot involved with everything that you were saying to say in 5 minutes. So thank you. Animah, I know that you always had a strong desire to fight racism. Tell us more about your background, why you started Speak Up at Work.
Hi, Pam. Thanks for inviting me here. First of all, I'll talk a bit about myself because I am biracial. I'm half Malay, so Malay from Malaysia, and half English. My mum lives here in the UK, so I'm calling in from London. Race has always been a factor because it's I've had half of my family are brown and the other half are white, and being able to navigate that. And it was never really an issue for me as a child within myself. But growing up in Malaysia, that was pretty much challenging because it is a very multicultural environment. So you have the Malays, you have the Chinese, you have Indians, and there are other races as well. And then when you want to throw in the expat white mix that comes in as well, because I did work in the corporate world, and that brings the power dynamics in a very different place as well. So just very quickly, I'm a lawyer by background, and I was practicing in Malaysia, and then I joined the oil and gas industry where I was corporate counsel, including general counsel, for about 14 years. And one of the things that was very important to me, because I looked at compliance and ethics and looking at issues of corruption, that kind of thing. But another thing that was very important to me was the issue of harassment. Sort of sexual harassment was a big thing, but also other forms of harassment. And that includes, discrimination, racial harassment, harassment when it came to sexuality and that sort of thing. And 10 years ago, and I realize it's just over 10 years ago, we rolled out a harassment-free policy in my company at the time. Sign it, implement it, do training and all that. And the very first harassment case that I handled was a racial harassment case, which I didn't really think about until much more recently as we start having these conversations again. And part of the training that we did was get people to understand how hurtful it could be when your own race is denigrated in some way. So one of the things, I came back to London, I started my own business, Speak Up at Work, co-founded Speak Up Academy, which is this amazing online community of very passionate change makers and leaders who look at various issues, speaking up on corruption, speaking up on safety, and of course, speaking up on harassment. So the whole racial dynamic comes in there. And we look at organizational culture, we look at power dynamics, we look at, the leaders and everyone else and what's going on there. I can talk a little later about the specific issues around speaking up on racism, but this is something that I felt very passionate about. People in workplaces feeling that it's safe to speak up if they see racist conduct or they see someone say something that's racist, whether it's something about them or somebody else, or even a race that's not even in the room, right? And they think, oh, well, no one's being hurt, nobody's hearing it. But we're talking about the culture that you're setting in that specific workplace. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Animah. And Andrea, I wanted you to talk a bit more about the program called McDermott. Sorry, Rise, McDermott Rise program that is actually providing pro bono legal advice to people of color.
Yeah, of course. And thank you, Pam, for inviting me to be on this panel. I think just like, several others have mentioned, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, a lot of corporate America was looking inward to see kind of how can they be, movers in change, right? What can they bring to the field to do something to tackle systemic racism? And McDermott Rise is really born out of, right after the incident happened, a group of associates in my office, I work out of Boston, kind of had a happy hour and to touch base, check in on everybody. And one of the associates, a man of color, actually brought up this idea that, hey, we're a major law firm, we're full service international market leading law firm with incredible resources and incredible legal talent. But those resources are generally spent on very wealthy clients, people who can afford our billable rates, and people, generally entrepreneurs of color don't have access to that type of resources, which would accelerate their business. So he thought, we should create a program where we provide for these entrepreneurs free legal services, everything from incorporation to intellectual property protection, to franchising, everything, and let them have access to our resources and have access to our network as well. And so out of that was born McDermott Rise, and I and another associate were, thought this idea was fantastic, and we should really push it up the ranks and make it a reality. And to sort of cut a long story short, although I'll go into this more in detail, the firm adopted this program maybe about 2 months after we came up with the idea, and now since then, since the rolling out of this program in about mid-July, we've had over 100 applicants apply for the supportive services. We've selected 14 out of the 20 slots available for this. And the companies have been just completely outstanding, really interesting, intriguing companies. We were looking for companies who have one or more founders of color, who have boards that are diverse, who have business plans and business models that are going to be disruptive to their markets. We've had some of the people that have been selected for this program are offering services where they're connecting people of color to healthcare providers of color, right? That's a service that didn't really exist at the time, and they're bringing it to market and disrupting the market and providing that type of service. So these are, really innovative companies that we're bringing to bear. And, we're not just giving them our legal services. Like I said before, they have access to a whole network. And that network includes, a lot of companies that we work with as clients asked to kind of be sponsors or supporters of this program once they heard about it, right? It was very well received, as corporate America, again, was looking for ways to get involved. And so they're bringing to bear their resources as well. Some of these being, VC funds that are bringing financial resources, trade organizations that are bringing their networks and their access to great personnel as well. So we're bringing together all of those resources for these companies that get selected, and even for the companies that don't get selected, because we've had so many high caliber people and companies apply. We're making sure that we are giving access to them for free legal forms, right? If they need to incorporate, or some free trainings as well, and just basic legal issues, and connecting them with people like these supporters as well, so that they can get their businesses off the ground and expanding and looking towards the future.
so much, Andrea. Madeline, you've been working with leaders for 20 plus years in the area of systemic racism and gender equality. Help us better understand how white privilege and fragility has really been holding us back from all these initiatives we're trying to do.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's a sort of a passion of mine my whole life to think about what it means to be white and understand dynamics of privilege. So one of the things that I talk about and I think is really important for white folks to understand is that we don't know enough about racial stress. Black, Indigenous people of color in this country consistently have to tolerate racial stress at all levels, whether it's interpersonal microaggressions, whether it's systemic, all the ways that Andrea is trying to intervene, whether it's, out in the world when they're confronted by police. So there's this phenomenon that white folks really don't appreciate. And one of the things, I actually think Kanga Chasa wrote an article in Medium recently. He said, I grew up African, but America makes it hard to be Black. And I don't think white folks, we don't understand this. We don't have that lived experience as part of how privilege plays itself out. So our low tolerance for racial stress shows up in the way that we respond when we're called out on our racism, when we are in decision-making situations in professional settings or in our interpersonal relationships. There's so many expressions of white fragility. There's denial, there's dismissiveness, there's defensiveness. So the 3 Ds, I like to unpack those. There's denial on many levels. Denial that I could possibly do anything that would harm somebody else. So how could I be complicit in this? Denial that there's a problem at all. So not having any sort of analysis to understand. White folks dismiss the experiences of people of color. We actually can't believe that the things that happen that we hear from people of color happen. And so we dismiss it. We want to minimize it. We can't tolerate it. It's too horrendous. So navigating all that, those are all manifestations of fragility. And then this defensiveness, I get, upset if somebody calls me out, if I've done something, if I've enacted a form of racism. And so these common, human natural ways of being, we all get defensive sometimes, we all dismiss, but when you layer and put this in a racial context, it makes any culture change effort impossible. There's white privilege and their white supremacy characteristics, a model that Tema Okun has created with her colleagues. And I like to think of these sort of fraternal triplets, if you will. There's 14 of them, but I'm specifically thinking about sense of urgency, power hoarding, and privilege being one of them. But when we fall into a sense of urgency and we enact because suddenly, oh my God, I have awareness and I need to do something, without understanding the implications of people around you to how that might land, it becomes problematic. Power hoarding is something, I think it was Peter or somebody in the earlier panel talking just about it's human nature. We have this sort of fight inside of us to want to have power. At the same time, it's also human nature for us to be connected and in a collective. Our brains are hardwired for connection. Brene Brown talks about that. So we're battling with ourselves. And when we fall prey to scarcity thinking is another one. If we think there's not enough and more is better, and this is just the way it is, nothing can change, all this stuff is gonna hinder our ability to do the kind of culture change work that companies embracing race equity needs to do. I think the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet, and when we're not thinking and leading with that orientation in our leadership programs, in our mission, our brand, we're selling ourselves short. The work that we do at Conditioning Leaders, and I'll talk more about this, is fourfold. And we describe, Minita was talking about DEI, we call it BEAD, so belonging, equity, inclusion, and diversity. And there's a whole lot of work that we need to do around what it means to create cultures of belonging. A lot of this is from John Powell's work at the Belonging and Othering Institute. So those are some thoughts at the moment.
Thank you so much, Madeline. And Minita, let's go ahead and talk about the strategies on the third and fourth component of what you're doing at BioGen IDEC related to diversity and inclusion. Thank you.
Sure. Yep. So, the first couple of areas of focus were pretty internally focused, with the exception of building the pipeline into the industry. And so as we started to really focus on equity, which is newer in a lot of spaces around diversity and inclusion work, we started to look at our business and in the context of underserved patients, and realizing that in every disease state there are underserved patient populations, and how do we make sure that there's representation of those individuals through our product life cycle in the clinical trials that we're staffing. And that's complex because we do not have a clean history as a country in terms of medical experimentation on various communities. And so understanding that building trust in some communities is going to take a very different approach than what we may be used to as an industry. And so looking for all the way from representation in clinical trials through medical publications. So for example, we happen to be in neurological diseases, and so MS is a disease area that we focus on. And for a long time, there was this misnomer for all sorts of reasons that MS is a white woman's disease, even though we're seeing a higher prevalence today of African-American women in MS. And so what that took was us, where data wasn't out there for us to actually start to publish in the space, not for ourselves only, but for the neurological community, for neurologists, for other companies, to start to change what the sort of patient with MS looks like. And so hoping to try to disrupt where bias may play a role in an inaccurate diagnosis or a prolonged misdiagnosis, if your sense of what a MS patient looks like. So that health outcomes was the third quadrant. Like, how do we assure that in the disease areas that we're focused on, that we're considering the needs and building in the needs of the underserved patient through the product life cycle? And lastly, that's the examples around commercialization, to understand how culture impacts things like adherence, that it may be quite common that when talking to the patient that in some communities, it's the patient, it's their significant other or caregiver, and then it's multiple family systems. So it's, a much bigger group of individuals that you're brought into the conversation. In some communities, it's about the community leadership and sort of thinking about it from the lens of church leaders, et cetera. And so thinking much more broadly about underserved patients through our product life cycle and sort of health outcomes, and what we could do as a company to start to address the inequities around health outcomes. COVID-19 has clearly taught us about these very real realities that are something for all of us to take on, but I do think that our industry is uniquely positioned to do so. Then the fourth quadrant is really around this concept of economic empowerment, and we looked at it in multiple ways. So there was a piece that was internal around pay equity and assuring that we did our own internal pay equity from a race and gender perspective, before we went out to potentially influence others. The second was around the spend that we have around suppliers and businesses that are minority owned, and how to double down and increase our commitment around Black owned and Latinx owned businesses specifically. And the third actually wasn't really part of our strategy. We introduced in June, as I had shared, this 4-part strategy. We had the quadrant of economic empowerment, and then we had an individual, an employee within our organization, who had a colleague at Netflix where they had made a commitment of investing money in a Black-owned bank and sort of putting money into a Black-owned bank. And this was then sort of spread through LinkedIn, and an employee who was part of our organization said, well, is that something that we would consider? And it fits squarely within the bucket of economic empowerment. We just made an investment in one United, one of the oldest Black-owned banks, and a $10 million investment. And so, what's been really powerful actually about the strategies, we sort of came from a place of listening, just got, started with getting the foundation out there, but then activating the organization and empowering from all levels to really work to now own what it means to bring this 4-part strategy to life.
Thank you so much, Minita. Next, I wanted to talk to Andrea and really highlight that change can happen in any part of the organization. As an associate with your colleagues, going to upper management to say, we have this new idea, really was courageous. I wanted to have you talk a bit more about that experience, and also what encouragement do you have for others on bringing these ideas forward to management so we can make changes at any level.
Thanks, Pam. I think the word courageous is probably a good one. Each of us who brought this idea forward was an associate, right? And for those of you who don't know sort of the law firm structure, the associates are kind of at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of the legal service. And, it can be very challenging and potentially career disadvantaging to rock the boat, right? And, I think each of us kind of recognize that if we're going to actually do something and affect change, all that is going to take courage, right? All that is going to take some level of risk. And, if you're serious about it and if you want that to happen, you kind of have to take the hit in that sense. But we were sort of, in some ways, fortunate because our firm leadership, despite sort of some of the initial reception was a little bit, oh, well, that sounds great, but it's going to cost a lot of money for us to just give free legal services. Who knows if the executive committee is going to accept something like that? And it really took somebody who had a lot of clout. This was a senior white male partner who really commanded a lot of authority in the firm to say, this is actually a really good idea, right? Like, sure, there's a lot of risks involved. Who knows if we're going to get enough applicants? Who knows if we're going to put this out there and it just falls flat? Sure. But he really embodied the idea of, like, we need to take this risk if we're going to make any sort of substantive change. And kind of once he got behind it, I think, the idea was sort of sold. He could easily sell it to the executive committee, and the committee got, very, very much behind it. And so, it took kind of two pieces coming together, right? The us at sort of the lower levels being willing to take that risk and present this idea, and then somebody at the leadership level being willing to say, I'm going to use my privilege, I'm going to use my position to forward this initiative and make change happen. And I think a lot of people, especially when instances like this come up, think, what can I actually do? Maybe I'm, at the bottom of the totem pole. Maybe, I just work in administration, and, they think that they're sort of limited in their impact on issues of racism and systemic racism. But I think in actuality, it's, every little thing actually counts, right? And we have a lot more power than we tend to think. Even in this initiative, though it's sort of driven by the legal services that we provide, our administrative staff were eager to raise their hand and say, what is it that we can do to help? And they helped us put together a database of our legal forms that could be used for the Rise participants, right? And some people might think, well, that's not going to bring down the whole system, but every one of these little things, helps, and that's going to help a company, regardless of being with their Rise participant or just someone who applied. It's going to help them expand their company, expand their dreams, and really move the needle. So, it does take a little bit of courage. I think Minita talked about, the need to be listening. It takes, the leadership to be willing to listen, to be willing to lead and expand what leadership looks like. But I think people should be encouraged that, you know, this is in some ways a new time, and people are trying to look inward and figuring it all out, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's they don't necessarily know how to do it. But, you know, if more of us kind of take those chances to make these things happen, I think more things will happen, and we will actually be able to push the needle further.
So much, Andrea. Madeline, you actually spoke about this a little bit earlier, but really, why do diversity inclusion programs not work the way as everybody expected? And then there was also from Kari Kusera. She was saying about, I keep hearing in professional context, it's a pipeline problem.
Right. Okay, I'll weave that in.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's many reasons. I'll highlight a few. One is that if you're going to do deep culture change work, it has to start from the top. And leaders often underestimate the role that they need to play in creating that kind of deep culture change, creating the conditions for deep culture change to happen. You know, we're stuck in a mindset of thinking that equality, we all need to treat each other equally. So we don't understand the difference between equality and equity. So that's a whole analysis conversation that needs to be driven throughout the system, throughout all the different levels. When a foundational analysis is missing, we don't know what problem we're solving. So representation is great, absolutely. We want diversity, but diversity does not create racial equity. Diversity does not dismantle white supremacy. It doesn't dismantle all of the pernicious ways that the wealth gap keeps increasing. Just today, I was in a conversation this week hiring somebody. And do you hire the person that has more experience because they've already done some version of this project? Or do you hire somebody who actually, you know, may not have as much experience, but they've got the chutzpah, you can tell they're willing to learn and grow. So it's these moments in our decision making that when we don't have an analysis about what it means to create a racially equitable culture, we run into trouble. This pipeline question, so sure, pipeline is a part of it, but culture change and racial equity work requires deep culture change. It requires a kind of trust that, again, culture change is proportional to the level of trust. We lose trust in buckets, but we gain it in drops. So there's all kinds of stuff that we're not even talking about when we layer on a diversity and inclusion set of, you know, initiatives without understanding what's the culture of trust in our organization. The pushback, the resistance comes up a lot. Training's great. Awareness building is great. But again, we can't train our way out of white supremacy. We can't project manage our way out of these things. So while this is all important, and most diversity and inclusion initiatives pour tons and tons of money into training. I'm a trainer. I make a lot of money training. And I know that's not the solution to culture change. I know that's not going to create a racially equitable culture. So at Conditioning Leaders, one of the things that we make sure if we're going to partner with an organization is that they're willing to work at 4 levels. There's awareness building, there's the analysis, developing a shared analysis so we can actually agree on the problems that we're solving. There's the actions then that we need to take, a lot of what Minita is talking about, a lot of what Andrea, like specific, you know, initiatives, actions to start to address the inequities, particularly the racial inequities. And finally, there's accountability and allyship. We have to be accountable to our values. We have to be accountable to our metrics. Another reason D&I initiatives don't work is we're not willing to take a stand and say, okay, by January, I'm making it up, by January 2022, our board is going to be 1/3 women and 1/3 people of color, full stop, we're going to make it happen. We're scared to make mistakes, we're scared to fall, and so we don't want to do anything. Or we don't want to, you know, put a stake in the ground around metrics that we can measure. And an initiative that really will do the deep work has some sort of foundational assessment, a cultural assessment that you need to do. What's current reality? Like what's so in our culture now? Then the analysis training needs to happen. then the policies and practices and all the tactical, practical ways that we're going to actually make the systemic changes we're talking about. And the fourth area is ongoing education, ongoing training, so that there's this loop over and over again. It's an iterative process to do deep culture change work. And some of that, a lot of that is missing when you just think about it from a diversity and inclusion lens.
Thank you, Madeline. And Animah, I wanted to see if you had any closing thoughts on some things that people can implement right away to start making some differences in the way they interact at the workplace.
Well, absolutely, because in the sort of speak up ethos, every individual is empowered to make change, right? So it's interesting because Madeline was talking about, sort of leadership and what the organization does. We also look at, well, what can you do as an individual? And, I'm sure tomorrow you're going to work or you're into your Zoom calls, the opportunity will arise, because there's always a situation where you're going to see either someone do something that's a little bit, it's never really blatant, right? But there will be some element of racism, or say something which kind of can also be borderline racism. And I thought it was very interesting. I saw somebody in the chat say, death by 1,000 paper cuts, because microaggression is very real, right? And a lot of people think, oh, that's nothing, it's just something little, get some thick skin and this is normal. But no, it can be quite hurtful. And whether it's something that happens to us personally or we witness it. So I'll just talk about speaking up from a witness perspective. You see something or you hear someone say something. So let's just talk about a meeting. This happens all the time. So in a meeting, someone says something which could be, I'm not sure about hiring those people because right? So maybe there's a racial element, and you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, that sounds a bit, I'm not sure. And often we have that. We kind of have this tingly sensation. But you know what we often do? We keep quiet, right? But now this is about really being intentional. Now we're looking at being an anti-racist, not being not racist, being actively an anti-racist. Speak up. So the first thing you should do is say something. Say, that is inappropriate. I mean, because I think most of you would work in companies where you talk about diversity and we say, well, that's going against our values. Let's step back. Put it in a way that doesn't feel threatening. I mean, the last thing you want to say is that's racist. Then you get this kind of, debate that starts coming up, and exactly what Madeline said, the denial, the defensiveness, and so on sort of kicks in. But if you're angry, go ahead, just say it, because I think this is the other thing where people are saying, oh, you have to be very polite. I mean, some people, you feel the anger, go ahead, just say it, right? But the main thing is make your feelings heard, right? I mean, say it. Or someone else say it for you, right? If you're in a position you're unable to do so. So the first thing is speak up. The second step is listen. So someone also mentioned listening, and listen meaning listen to understand, listen to learn, not listen to argue back and say, no, you're wrong. I mean, like Andrea, I come from a lawyer background, and that's our psyche. We're listening in order to give you another attack. But no, this is listen to sort of open up and go, oh, because what people are sharing with you are their lived experience. So the worst thing is to deny it and dismiss it and say, oh, come on, that's nothing, because it's really, really hurtful. And we're looking at, you want to create inclusive workplace, a listening workplace. So that's the second step. So speaking, listening. And the third one is amplify. So, you can be in a meeting and you may have people from different backgrounds. Maybe you have, a whole bunch of white people and one black person in that meeting, right? And, everybody's saying things, and the black person or the person of color says something, and then someone else interjects, right? Now, we know as women, we see this a lot, right? Now put it in a racial context, same thing, right? Somebody else interjects, talks over whatever it is. If you see that happening, go, hang on, she hasn't finished yet. Let's hear what she has to say. So what you're doing is you're creating that space for the person of color to be heard, And also amplify, agree and go, yeah, you know, that's a really good point. Because I think, again, as women, we're so used to a man saying exactly what we said and everybody goes, yes, and you're sitting there going, what? Right? Same thing. You know, so amplify. And let's say they haven't spoken. And often this happens because, you know, it comes with the microaggression. If over months and years you've been talked down, you just sit in the meeting thinking, you know, why am I going to say it if nobody's listening anyway? And it's not, and I mean, it's not because they don't have the ideas. It's just that they've got to a point that no one's listening. So again, open up that space, amplify by creating that space and saying, you know, like Minita, I'd be really interested in what you have to say about this. And in a sense, open that, they come in, say something, and then validate and say that was awesome. And you know, it sounds, it's small, but it's huge for the individual concerned. And what you will see over time is that people start coming forward and saying things because they know they're being validated, they're knowing they're being heard. So again, this is what we can do as individuals, and it's not difficult, really.